The snow was falling in slow, shimmering breaths the morning Winona Red Elk first saw the lonely ranch framed against the pale horizon, as though the land itself were holding its voice quiet. She walked with her head lowered, boots worn thin, the cold gnawing at the edges of her strength. Grief travels light, yet it weighs more than any bundle, and she felt every ounce of it pressing between her shoulder blades as the wind curled around her like a curious spirit. She kept her late husband's small burlap pouch tucked beneath her coat, a final tether to a life that had slipped through her fingers too soon. Still, even as she walked, she felt a strange tug, as if something unseen was waiting for her just beyond the next drift, stirring a quiet question in her chest. Far ahead, a curl of smoke rose from the chimney of a solitary ranch house perched along Red Willow Ridge. The sky around it glowed faintly, catching the pale fire of dawn, and she wondered who lived there, whether they were kind, or whether they'd turn away a widow like her the way so many had these past months. Her steps faltered at the memory of staring eyes in the last town, whispers about her being too young to carry so much loss, side glances that pushed her deeper into her shell. The thought of facing more judgment made her stomach tighten, yet the cold pressed harder, urging her toward the faint, hopeful warmth ahead. She told herself she only needed shelter for a few hours, but the soft pulse beneath her ribs hinted she was walking toward something far larger, though she couldn't yet name it. At the ranch, Attila Wolf had been clearing snow from the barn roof since before sunrise, his breath rising in slow clouds that vanished before they reached the heavens. He preferred mornings like this, the kind where the world was muffled and no one expected him to speak. Silence had become his closest companion after his brother's death, and every winter seemed to echo that loss a little louder. Still, he worked with steady hands, fixing the things he could because it distracted him from the things he could not. When his gaze drifted toward the fence line, he paused mid-shovel, the weight of the tools suddenly inconsequential. A lone figure trudged across the plain, leaning into the wind as though fighting a battle no one else could see. Something in the shape of her struggle struck him, stirring old shadows and a fragile spark of curiosity that tasted almost like concern. He lowered the shovel and took a hesitant step toward her, unsure whether he should intervene. The last time he'd followed an instinct like that, grief had swallowed him whole. But when she stumbled, knees buckling into the snow, the choice snapped into place inside him, finding a part of his heart he thought had closed for good. Without thinking, he rushed across the yard, boots crunching through the drifts. By the time he reached her, her breath was shallow, her cheeks raw, her shoulders trembling beneath a thin coat. She looked up with dark, wary eyes filled with both endurance and exhaustion, and in that single moment, something quiet and unspoken passed between them, something neither of them could decipher. Before he could ask her name, she sagged forward, trusting him by necessity or fate, and he gathered her into his arms with the care of a man used to holding fragile things. Inside the ranch house, warmth seeped gently into her limbs, drawing an involuntary sigh from her lips. Attila set her near the fire, the glow casting soft light over her features. Fine, strong cheekbones, wind-chapped skin, shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and too many small heartbreaks. He hesitated before handing her a tin cup of steaming tea, his fingers brushing the rim as though anchoring himself to the moment. She accepted it slowly, eyes tracing the chipped metal as though it held its own story. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was low and hesitant, thick with the weight of miles walked alone. "My name is Winona," she said, each syllable a cautious offering. Attila nodded, the sound of her name lingering in his mind like a half-remembered melody. "Attila," he replied, simple, unadorned, yet somehow intimate. His voice held a rasp, as though unused to speaking more than a few words at a time. She studied him, not with fear, but with a soft, searching curiosity that made his pulse catch. Something about her presence unsettled the quiet walls he'd built, yet he couldn't bring himself to retreat from it. Winona sipped her tea and let the warmth crawl slowly into her bones. She didn't reveal much, only that she'd lost her husband last spring, and the grief had become too loud to bear in the places that once knew her. Townsfolk talked. Doors closed. Every gesture had begun to feel like pity tinged with suspicion, pushing her farther and farther from belonging. Attila listened with the kind of attentiveness that made her chest ache, as though he understood how the smallest judgments could break a person down grain by grain. She sensed there were stories he wasn't telling, shadows he kept tucked just behind his eyes, and the quiet mystery of him drew her in more with every passing heartbeat. She wondered why his kindness felt like a fragile promise she wasn't sure she should trust. When morning arrived, Attila hitched his wagon and offered to take her into town so she could look for work or supplies. She hesitated, remembering the stares that had carved into her confidence, but she nodded, reminding herself she could endure anything for a few moments if it meant building a path forward. The snow had softened into a thin, sparkling blanket, and cold sunlight stretched across the world like a hopeful arm. Yet when they reached the small cluster of buildings that made up Hazeltine, the familiar prickle of judgment settled on her skin. People paused mid-step to look at her, some curious, others openly critical, murmuring about the young widow who had arrived with the reclusive wolf rancher. The sting of it tightened her throat and she instinctively stepped back, but Atsala moved subtly forward, placing himself between her and the harshest gazes. He didn't touch her. He simply shifted, blocking the wind and the weight of their scrutiny. It was such a small gesture, so restrained, so quietly protective, that it softened something brittle inside her. She wondered why this man, who barely spoke, could offer such instinctive gentleness without asking anything in return, yet the question lingered in her mind long after they returned to the wagon. Back at the ranch, the hours unfolded like a reprieve from the world. Atsala introduced her to Ghost Runner, a silver-gray stallion with wary eyes and a spirit shaped by old fears. Winona approached slowly, her breath steady, her hand outstretched but patient. Atsala watched as the horse hesitated, then nudged her palm with his muzzle. A warm flutter moved through her chest as though trust, long absent, had found her again in the shape of an animal who understood brokenness. When their hands brushed by accident, the moment held them suspended, a fragile pause filled with unspoken meaning. She pulled away gently, but the echo of the touch lingered in her skin. As the light dimmed, Atsala showed her the wind chimes he crafted from discarded metal, each piece shaped with intention. He explained they hung along the ridge not to chase spirits away, but to guide them home when the nights grew long. Winona listened to the soft, uneven ring of the chimes, feeling the notes ripple through her chest. One chime in particular released a tone unlike the others, a low, steady hum that felt like a question she couldn't yet decipher. She glanced at Atsala, wondering whether he heard it too or whether it was meant only for her. That evening, a sudden storm swept across the plains, wind howling around the ranch house like a wounded animal. The lantern light flickered in uneven patterns against the walls, imitating the tremor beneath Winona's ribs. Something in the storm unraveled the fragile composure she'd been clinging to, and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She tried to hide them, ashamed of appearing weak in front of a man who seemed carved from quiet resilience. Yet Atsala noticed. He approached without urgency, offering her a thick wool blanket and nothing more, respecting the boundaries she hadn't spoken aloud. It was the gentleness of his restraint that finally allowed her breath to steady. When she asked him why he lived alone, a shadow crossed his face. For a long moment he seemed to wage war with something inside him, then finally he spoke. He told her about his brother, the river accident, the helplessness, the guilt that had wrapped around his chest like barbed wire ever since. He admitted that distancing himself from people felt easier than facing their expectations or sympathy. But there was something about Winona's presence that quieted the darker corners of his mind, though he didn't dare say it outright. His vulnerability settled softly between them, stitching their separate wounds into a shared cloth of understanding. She found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn not by romance but by the simple, steady truth of his pain. Outside, the wind softened as though listening to their breath instead of the storm. The next day, the local judge, an older man with a stiff posture and a reputation for harsh words, arrived to finalize year-end ranch filings. His gaze landed sharply on Winona, then on Atsala, and something in his expression soured. He muttered that it wasn't proper for a young widow to be living under a man's roof without expectation or clarity. His words carried a sting that reopened every old wound Winona had tried so hard to cauterize. But Atsala remained composed, shoulders squared, eyes steady, not defending her with anger, but standing beside her with a dignity that turned the judge's cruelty hollow. Winona realized in that moment that she could not withstand the town's suspicions forever. She also realized that something inside her had softened toward Atsala, something tender, unexpected, and deeply human. He seemed to feel it too because when the judge prepared to leave, Atsala turned to her with a tremor in his voice, offering not a confession but a choice. He asked whether she would consider making a life with him, not out of obligation but out of mutual need and the fragile, growing trust between them. His hand didn't reach for her. It waited, suspended in hope rather than demand. She took it. The wedding happened beneath gentle snowfall between the barn and a cedar that had weathered decades of storms. The judge, somewhat chastened, performed the ceremony with more humility than she expected. Winona felt her heart settle as Atsala spoke the simple vows, his voice quiet but filled with reverence. When he leaned close, whispering, "I'm here to hold you," the words didn't feel like a promise of possession, but a recognition of two souls choosing to stand together against winter. And when they stepped back, the world felt strangely new, as though the snow itself had blessed the fragile beginning forming between them. As you read this now, maybe you'll remember that love does not always enter loudly, it often arrives in storms, in silence, in tired hearts learning to hope again. Sometimes the person meant to steady you is the one you meet while searching for shelter, both of you carrying stories you're afraid to tell. And perhaps, beyond the edge of your own winter, someone is already walking toward you, ready to offer the quiet kind of grace that changes everything, if you're willing to open your hands and let it.